This morning we're going to look at another interesting story in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 16. So let's pray and we'll spend a couple minutes looking at this section. Father, thank you so much for your grace, your mercy, your greatness. And this morning as we remember the sacrifice of our Messiah, who gave his life so that we could have a new life, a clean life, an eternal life. Father, we praise you for his work. And we also pray that the Spirit of God would fill us, that we might be able to understand your purpose in including the story this morning from Genesis chapter 16. And we ask this in the name of our Messiah. Amen. Genesis chapter 16 is a very interesting story about Sarah and her maid Hagar. I know many times people say Hagar, which doesn't really matter, but in Hebrew usually the emphasis is on the last syllable. So if you're going to make a mistake, you always emphasize that. But I actually met somebody named Hagar. So I know that's the way you say her name. On account, I called her Hagar, and she gave me So Sarah and Hagar. Moses starts out by writing this in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. Several years ago, I was teaching here during the Bible study week, and I spoke about Sarah, and I'm very sympathetic to her. I think so often she's just mistreated. In this particular chapter, there's plenty of blame to go around between both Sarah and Abram. So it's not really her fault. She's usually the one that bears the blame, but there's plenty to go around here. And here, I think, too, I've heard there's several different Bible translations. I've heard people say, Sarah was barren. And personally, that really grates on me, that term. I do not like the term. I know what it means. I know in times past it was an acceptable term. But to me, it seems to be a term that lacks empathy. To say that this woman was barren. Yes, she could not have children. But that was a burden that she had to bear. I mean, even to this very day, when people have a hard time getting pregnant, people go through a lot of stress, very stressful time. And I think in this day and age, when Sarah could not have children, it was twice as bad because people looked at it as a judgment from God, that God punished that person, therefore they could not have children. And we see that in the patriarchs with Abraham. We see it with Isaac. We see it with Jacob. They complain to God because you are the giver of children. I don't have any children. Why are you withholding children from me? And this certainly was true with Sarah. I mean, remember, she had traveled with Abraham from all the way from Babylon up into Haran, down into Israel. She followed along with him. She was given away as his sister to be the wife of Pharaoh. I mean, she went through this whole thing. She also knew the promises God made to Abraham that he would have children. And here she's without children, and she's thinking that God is the culprit here. She had no children. It was a difficult time. People in our day can go and get fertility treatment. They can get scientific tests and whatever. This woman was kind of alone in her suffering, I think. And again, in her day, it was a social stigma. So it says she had no children. However, she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. And Hagar, as she came, she most likely was given to Abram, as I said a few weeks ago, when Abram was down there and Pharaoh wanted to take Sarah as his wife. He gave Abram a lot of goods and wealth and animals. It also says male and female servants, and I'm 99% sure that Hagar was one of the female servants that was given to Abram by Pharaoh so that he could marry his wife. Because it makes no other sense. How in the world would he get an Egyptian servant living in the land of Canaan or Israel when he came from Babylon unless it was given from Pharaoh? Very possible that's where she came from. So she's there, and how did she get to be a part of the entourage? Again, this is not as a critique and observation, but it was Abram's lack of faith. Remember? God told him to go into the land. He went into the land, and when he got to the land, what happened? There was a famine. And Abram He trusted God, but he wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen. He knew if he stayed where he was, there was no food. He knew there was food down in Egypt, so he decided to go down into Egypt. And when he got down into Egypt, he had another little lack of faith as they were just going to cross through passport control. He said to his wife, listen, these guys are going to think you're beautiful. They're going to kill me so they can marry you. So do me a favor, be my sister, which technically she was. That was the plan. When Pharaoh heard about it, took her and gave Abram all these different things. And I think Hagar was one of those things that he gave, a servant to Abram. The idea here that she's an Egyptian maid, the word that's used for maid is not a personal high servant, but a menial servant. She was just kind of one of the members of the household, kind of the people that would go unnoticed. That's who Hagar was. So Sarah, she has no children. She sees this maid, and she says in verse 2 to Abram, listen, she says, so Sarah said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, and perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Now, Sarah was right that it was the Lord who prevented her from having children, but it was for a different reason than she thought. The reason that God prevented her from having children at this time was he was building the faith of Abram and Sarah. Abram was the father of the Jewish nation. Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11 is called the father of our faith. He is the example of having faith. And he and Sarah were still on the journey. They were not quite ready yet. So God prevented her from having children. Sarah saw this as God preventing her almost as a punishment. God promised Abram that he would have children. He did not. Sarah cannot figure out why this is. And she starts thinking, well, maybe there's a plan B here. And it says that she said to him, go into my maid. Now, remember where they came from. When we're introduced to their family, they're coming from Ur of the Chaldees, which is in modern-day Babylon. And they were under Babylonian social customs. One of the customs that the Babylonians had was that if a man was married to a woman who could not have children, he was allowed to take one of the household servants, have children through her, and that would count as his heir. That was acceptable social custom of the day. And this is what Sarah said. Listen, I want you to go into my maid as the custom of the day was. Now this word here too, used go into my maid, is a euphemism obviously for sexual relationship, but it's not an intimate sexual relationship. We see in the scriptures that Adam knew his wife. Jacob knew his wife. That's a term for intimate sexual relationship between a husband and wife. Here, that phrase is not used. It's go into my maid. She's a surrogate. We all know it. She's to serve a certain purpose. That's what Moses is writing there. And then he says, she says, maybe I'll obtain children through her. And the literal translation is be built up through her. She was going to build up her household by having children through this surrogate mother. That was Sarah's plan. And then, if you'll permit me, I was trying to think of a different phrase, but I think this might be the most apt. If you will let me throw a hand grenade into the room. It says, and Abram listened to the voice of his wife. It was not a good idea. He was supposed to be the spiritual leader in his home. According to the scriptures, a man is the spiritual head of his household. Now, if you know me and you've heard me teach about several different things, this does not mean a dictator, a boss, a rat. That's not what it's talking about here. It means a man is to provide leadership in his home in a spiritual sense. And the reason is that the man is held responsible by God for the direction that his family goes in. So it's not you're given the leadership. No, you're given the responsibility. And this was Abram's thing. He was supposed to have done something. We see a very similar incident to this a few chapters earlier. In the garden, in Genesis chapter 3, we have the story of Adam and Eve. And in that, we see that God tells them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent comes, tempts Eve. She eats the fruit. And then what does she do? She gives it to Adam, has him eat it, tells him to eat it. This is what it says in Genesis 3. Moses, remember the same author, writes this. God is talking to Adam and Eve after they ate the fruit, after the fall of mankind. And he says, then he said to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat from, cursed is the ground because of you, and in toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Adam heard the instructions from God himself and should have known when Eve asked him to eat the fruit, he should have said no. He was the leader of the household, and he failed in his spiritual leadership. And because of that, he's held responsible for that. We see a similar thing here with Abram. God promised him word to word, that you were going to have children. And Sarah says, listen, let's get my maid. And he should have said no, but he didn't. And God holds Abram responsible for that. I know sometimes, this whole idea of listening to the voice of your wife, I know people might get a little upset about that, but Job did not listen to the voice of his wife. Remember the story of Job? I mean, it's, you got to get through the first beginning and middle of the book. It's not easy. That's one tough book, and it is one bad news after another. The worst thing in the world happened to this guy. He loses everything he owns. He loses his servants, and then he loses his children. Ultimately, like, what could be worse? And what advice does his wife give him? Do you remember? She said, why don't you just curse God and die? Job says, nah, I'll take another option. Job said no. He said, I came with nothing, I'll leave with nothing, but blessed be God. So here we see someone who does the opposite of that. And again, I because of the world we live in, I'll overemphasize it. The husband is not the dictator here. The husband is responsible for the direction of his family when it comes to spiritual things. And God holds him responsible. And that's why he said, you should not have listened to the voice of your wife when she told you to do something wrong. And I don't blame Sarah. I cannot imagine how difficult that would be for her. First of all, the social stigma. Every time you go out of your tent, in your whole little world, everybody knows you never had a kid. People are talking about it. I remember Haddon Robinson one time gave an illustration of people. He said, if you listen to people, most of the time they're complaining about people who they work with. That's really true. He said, we always gossip about people. If we gossiped about ideas, we would be a race of intellectual giants. But we're not, because we gossip about people. And people are the same by nature. I'm certain that Sarah had a very difficult time, and this seemed like a good solution to her. And people that condemn her for lack of faith, I honestly think that they don't know how to look in the mirror. I mean, really. This woman, she was having a hard time. She finally came up with what she thought was okay, and according to the customs of her day, here's my solution. That's what she's thinking. And I guess, in a way, just as if people had gone to the doctor today and had fertility treatments, this was her fertility plan. It was a solution to her problem. Needed a kid? I can get one. That's what she was thinking. In verse 3, Moses says, and after Abram lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. And here again, I think we see a little thing about Sarai. They lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years. She wasn't there for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 years. She was there for 10 years. And I don't know, I tried to think this morning, how many things have you prayed about for 10 years? How many things have you waited for 10 years? I'm not saying you don't, it hasn't happened, but 10 years. Her faith wanes a little bit. I don't blame her. I'm like that after 10 minutes. I go, well, what's going on? And then somebody else tells you, I was praying to God and he did this. Well, why? Why is he listening to you? I was praying first. It's just human nature. I mean, this woman's there for 10 years, waiting for 10 years for this promise to be fulfilled. It says, gave Hagar, her maid, to Abram as his wife. And that obviously means giving her so that they could have children. In verse 4 it says, he, Abram, went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw she conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. You can imagine the tension in the old camp with that, right? He goes into Hagar, she gets pregnant immediately, and she saw that she conceived in her. The whole world changed. Everything was different. First of all, it was humiliating for Sarai. I mean, this is the wife of the head of the clan. Didn't have any children. She's got to go outside every day and face this community, and beside her is this pregnant maid who her husband had gotten pregnant. It says she despised her. She became despised in her sight. There's a social shift. The maid goes from the bottom to the top, and now she's getting pretty haughty. She begins to treat Sarai in a disrespectful way. The word despised her is the same word used in Genesis 12 when God says, I will curse those who curse you. It's the same word, to esteem lightly, to disrespect. Anybody that disrespected Abraham and his descendants, God would disrespect them. That's what he's telling him. And now this is the same thing that's happened within the household of Abram. Hagar begins to despise Sarah, public. She goes from a menial maid to the mother of a child, the head of the clan. Proverbs 30 speaks about this, as it says, under 3 things the earth quakes, under 4 it cannot bear up. Under a slave when he becomes a king, and a fool when he is satisfied with food, under an unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she supplants her mistress. The world can't handle these things. And that's what was happening in Sarai's world. It turned upside down, and she just couldn't handle it. And she said in verse 5 to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. So Sarah is very upset about this treatment, and she goes to her husband and she complains to him. And she says to him, listen, this girl is treating me really disrespectfully. She's in public. She said, you better do something about this. And I said to Sharon, this is kind of crazy. Like, she asks for this to happen, and then it happens, and she goes to Abram and says, what are you doing? And Sharon said to me, the reason that she was so upset is because her husband didn't come to her defense and just let everything kind of go on. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I do not do marriage counseling. Just so you know, if I have to put it in a verse, there it is. It's true. She comes to me and says, what's going on? Like, where are you? What's happening here? You know what's happening. And when I talked before about plenty of blame to go back and forth, here's Abram's response in verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, listen, your maid is in your power. Do what is good to her in your sight. And Sarai treated her harshly, and she, Hagar, fled from her presence. So we see again, first of all, Abram did not take leadership in his house because he listened to the voice of his wife. Second, when his wife came to him and said, there's a problem, what does he do? He, in modern terms, even though I don't know how you feel about the whole NFL controversy, but it popped in my mind, so regardless of politics, he punts. That's what he does. He punts back to her. Okay, honey, she's yours. You take care of it. Do whatever you think is best. He's not sure where to go. He doesn't want to start a big problem. Look, there's already a problem here. My wife's upset. You know what, babe? Do what you think is right. That's what he does. And what does she do? She treats her the same way she was being treated. Again, I know that people give her a hard time. This woman was hurt. This woman was humiliated. This woman was looking for some help. She got none. So what does she do? She's hurt. She hurt someone else. That's what she did. And we see that Abram's house is in an uproar. I mean, people often talk about Bible characters. This man spoke to God himself. This guy's house is in an uproar. His wife's mad. The maid left. What's going on here, you know? That's what's happening in the house of Abram. I mean, it's not a good situation. So, do whatever you want. So, you know what? You treat me bad, I'll show you. You want to be treated bad, I'll show you. And I cannot imagine. You know, she's a menial servant. What did she do? She made her do all, who knows what kind of jobs, whatever. Made sure she knew who was the boss. And Hagar's response is, she's going to take off. And that's what she does. She's gone. So, we have a woman came up with a plan, a man who allowed the plan. We have a whole problem, and now the household's all broken up. So Hagar takes off, and it says in verse 7, "Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur." This phrase, the angel of the Lord, a little controversy. Sometimes people argue about it. I think it means it's a picture of the pre-incarnate Messiah. Before Jesus came to earth, before he took on a human form, he had, and that's in the flesh, the pre-incarnate, before he becomes human, I think there's appearances of the Messiah in the Old Testament. I think that this is one of them. He appears, it says the angel of the Lord, a phrase used only in the Old Testament, not used after Jesus comes to earth. It's a specific person, the angel of the Lord. There's many arguments about it could be a different person. I think the bottom line is that here, this is a picture of the Messiah who came to speak to Hagar in the wilderness. That's what I think. I think that's a simple understanding of the text. I think that's why he's called the angel of the Lord. He comes to her by a spring of water. It says, in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Shur was a city on the way between Canaan and Egypt. So this makes perfect sense too in the story, because where's Hagar going when she leaves? Or where's she going to go? She's going home. That's where she's going. And she's pregnant. She needs some help. She's on her way back to Egypt. Her family's probably still there. She has friends there. She's not going to stay there. So when she's found by the spring on the way to Shur, it makes perfect sense. And the angel appears to her and then asks her a series of questions. First he says, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, there's so many great things in this, really. And I think, first of all, here's the Messiah. I believe, again, you could disagree with me and be wrong, that's fine. But I think here's the Messiah, and he addresses her by name. We often talk about God. I mean, God is an inconceivable concept and personage, but he's so personal to each one of us. We talk about that. He knows her name. He knows your name. He knows my name. He knows everyone's name. It's incredible to me. You meet somebody, Hagar. Yes, that's me. Yeah. He said, where have you come from? Where are you going? What's up? What's going on? And this is an interesting thing to me too, because we see from this verse God's perspective of what happened. See, Sarai gave Hagar to Abram, and it says, go into her, and she will be your wife. Now, in the custom of the day, if a man did have a servant and got her pregnant, she was considered a second wife. And sometimes, if the first wife still did not have children, the second wife becomes the preeminent wife. And in the mind of Sarai, Hagar is the wife of Abram. But do you see what the angel says? He says, Hagar, Sarai's maid. In God's sight, she is still the maid. Doesn't disrespect her, doesn't belittle her, but this is God's view of what's happening here. And it's weird, isn't it, to give an explanation like that? Hagar, Sarai's maid, yeah, it reminds her of who she is as well, because, Hagar is not innocent in this whole thing either. She had an attitude problem. In the custom of the day, she figures that she's replacing her master's wife. And what does God say? Hey, Sarai's maid, he kind of gently straightens out the situation. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Reminds her of her position. And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. You know what? I had enough. You don't know what it's like to work for her. I mean, you tell me you've not had a boss in your life, you don't know what it's like working for that guy. I can't stand him. I can't stand her. I've had it right up to here. Wasn't there a country song about that? Take this job and yeah. So it's kind of like that. I think that's her attitude. If she was a country singer, she might have been singing that song. But that's really what she's saying. I had enough. How much can I take? I'm going home. And it says, then, verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Oh, man. Oh, man. Who wants to hear that? And I hate that. Look, go back and submit yourself to the person in authority. Oh, no. I can see her shaking her head. You don't know. Listen, if you knew what I knew, you know what it's like being with her. She treats me bad. I'm not going to submit to her authority. That's why she left. And he says, look, to her. And I think that this is so often true in the case of Scripture and in life. God gives us commands, and they're associated with promises. And when we disobey God's command, we short ourselves of the promises that God wants to give us. That's the way it works. I don't like it. I mean, I wish you could go around it. I'm sure she did. But God said, listen, you need to go and do what you are supposed to do. And when you do that, I'll give you a promise. And the angel said to her, moreover, verse 10, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. You hear a promise like that made before? Promise made to Abram, remember? Your descendants will be more than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. This is a guy who had no kids. Now here's a woman, most likely a young girl, out in the wilderness by herself, running away, and doesn't want to go back. And God said, listen, you go back, you do what you're supposed to do, and I promise you something. I'm going to give you so many descendants, it's going to be impossible to count them. That's a pretty powerful promise to a maid, a menial servant. God noticed her. God promised her. And then it says, the angel of the Lord said further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son. It kind of sounds a little bit like the words given to Miriam when the angel came to her and told her that she was going to be pregnant and give birth to the Messiah. See, you are with child, and you'll have a son. I believe I didn't have time to really check every verse in the earlier chapters, but this may have been the first gender reveal party out in the wilderness. People didn't know they were having a boy or a girl. I had no idea what was going on. And the angel said, you know what? You're going to have a son. Wow. That's great. You're going to have so many descendants, you won't be able to count them. Wow. That's incredible. And then he says, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Ishmael literally means God hears. The Lord hears. You think about that, significance of that name. Here is a woman, young girl, in the wilderness. She's suffering. She's hurting. And what's her son's name? God hears. What an encouragement that is. God hears. God has heard. God's responding. I mean, he knows her by name. He understands her problem. And he says, you're going to have this boy, and every time you call his name, you'll be reminded that I heard you. That's phenomenal. You know, sometimes people name their children after parents or relatives, because when you hear that name, It reminds you of that person. Brings a memory back to you. That's the same thing that was happening here. You call him Ishmael because every time you think you're alone, every time you have a problem, every time you're suffering, you remember, I hear. Incredible name. It's always a reminder to her. Imagine how comforting this would be through her life. We don't really hear about her after this, but I'm certain her life was not always easy and pleasant. You know, when she went back home, there's probably an adjustment period. I don't think Sarai said, "Oh, wow, I was so good to see you. You're gone good." And there was continued problems when Isaac is born and when he starts to grow up and Ishmael picks on him. Sarah says, "You got to get rid of that woman and her child. I mean, how long are they going to hang around? Toss them out of here." I mean, there was never complete healing in that relationship. It's a difficult time. And I think that through those difficulties, God hears, God heard. Every time, Ishmael, God hears, God hears. And there was a reminder to Abram and Sarah as well. God hears. And I think that it's something that we need to remember too, because we have these difficult times. Isn't it frustrating and amazing that God can do the most wonderful thing in answer to our prayers, and 3 weeks later we're wondering, like, well, what's going on? Like, how am I going to wait? We all need to be reminded. We're people. This name served to reminded all the people in that household. And then he gives a description of the boy. He says, he will be a wild donkey of a man. That doesn't sound very complimentary. Other versions use other words for this, but it's talking about the personality of Ishmael. In Israel, even to this day, there are wild donkeys called onagers. And they just roam free throughout the countryside. They go wherever they want. And that's kind of the idea here. He'll be a wild onager of a man. Ishmael is going to roam all around. That's his character. And if you've been to Israel, you've read things, about the Bedouins. Bedouins travel from place to place. The Bedouins are the only people in the Middle East that are allowed to go from country to country without passports, or they can go from Israel to Jordan to Egypt. They can go anywhere they want. They just travel freely all around the area. The only people allowed to do that. And that's kind of this idea. Your son is going to be a roamer. He'll wander all around. He's going to live outside of society. That's the kind of idea. And it says his hand will be against everyone. His free roaming lifestyle is going to cause friction with all of his neighbors because he's just moving around with this. There's an old Arab saying, and the saying is, "Me and my brother against my cousin. Me and my cousin against the world." And that kind of sums up this. His hand will be against everyone. He's going to want to be on his own. He doesn't want people to bother him. And everyone's hand will be against him. He's against everyone. Everyone will be against him. There's all friction. The descendants of Ishmael, there's always friction going on. And then it says, and he will live to the east of all of his brothers. And here, we're talking about the descendants of Isaac. That there will always be tension between Ishmael and Isaac. And he will live to the east. He'll move off to the side. He will not live among his brothers. Now, in the land of Israel, there are still Israelis and Arabs that live together. For the most part, in the past, up until probably the first Intifada 30 years ago, whatever, there was good relationship in general between most of the Israelis and Arabs. It's only been in the last 40 years or so that there have been real problems. Part of that was because of the wars and the West Bank being a separated territory and Gaza becoming a separated territory. But before that, people generally got along. But mostly today, Israelis and Arabs outside the land do not have a good relationship. Israeli in the territories, and I personally, this is the most political you'll ever hear me get. I will never call them occupied territories because I don't believe that. That's my personal opinion. But those territories where the Palestinians live caused tons and tons of friction in the land of Israel. And part of that was predicted from here. There'll be a lot of friction between him. He's going to be a roaming person. He's going to live outside of society. He's going to live outside of his brothers. So with this great promise of being a multitude of people, we get a little bit of picture of the personality of Ishmael. So Hagar hears all these things, and this is what she says. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive after seeing him?" Now this goes back to the idea of the servant of the Lord. Is this the Messiah? Well, what happens when people see the Lord? They were terrified to see the Lord because they thought they were going to die. It was believed you cannot see God and live. And every time the angel of the Lord shows up, that's what people say. I've seen God and I've lived. I've seen God and I lived. There's no correction in there. It doesn't say, but they thought. No, they saw God, the pre-incarnate Messiah. And that's what she said. I have seen God and I lived. Shall I live? And this is an incredible thing too. Think about this experience. First, God hears her, and now she sees God. It's incredible. This is the maid out in the wilderness. God sees me. God hears me, to her. And she said she was surprised she was seeing him. Do you remember that song, El Shaddai, years ago? Remember there's a verse in there that says, "To the outcast on her knees, you are the God who really sees." That's a verse about Hagar. She's the outcast on her knees. God saw her, God heard her, God came to her. And this idea of seeing him, a pre-incarnate Messiah. And here's your theological word for the week to show off to your friends. Christophany. That's literally what it means. That it's a picture, an appearance of the pre-incarnate Messiah before he came in the flesh. This was a Christophany. So he appeared to her, told her, and she said, "You see me." And then it says, she renamed the well that was there, the spring. It was called Bir Laharoi, because, behold, it is between Kadesh and Bared. Nobody really knows where Bared is. We know where Kadesh is, but we don't know where Bared is. But it's renamed to the God who sees. The God who sees me. So people took water from the well. The God who sees me were also reminded of this event. So Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael, followed his instructions. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Okay, a couple of quick thoughts in conclusion. First of all, from this passage, we see that a husband has a responsibility to lead the spiritual direction of his household. If he does not, his house goes into an uproar. That's what's happening here. I don't want to get into all the ins and outs of this. I know we live in a complicated world, and I know, somebody, after I mention a statement like that, there's always somebody who comes up to me and says, "You don't know my husband, he's a real rat." Be that as it may, it's his responsibility and he's going to be held responsible for that. Just as I would never tell a wife, if a husband tells you to do something that's sinful, you can't do it. We have a higher authority than a husband or wife, and that's God. And if a husband asks you to do something that's immoral, especially, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. You can't. On the other hand, it's a husband who's held responsible for the direction of his house. And I don't want there to be a reason to throw out the whole section. This is God's plan. I know because we are sinners, God's plan is often twisted in our lives. But this is God's ideal goal. And I would suggest, if your husband is that bad, I know that's what Sharon does, she prays to God about me. God hears. God sees. God knows. God has the ability to correct. Regardless of, this is an impossible situation, God fixed it. He can do the same thing at home. The second thing about this that I see is that it's better to wait on God than to come up with our own solution. And that kind of was mentioned in the text a few weeks ago. Because God has a different purpose than us. God's purpose is to shape each one of us to be like the Messiah. That was his purpose in this whole incident. And I often hear people quote Romans 8:28. "For we know God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose." People quote that all the time when they go through difficulty. But they never quote 29. 29 is very closely attached to 28. And 29 says, For those he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And that's a tough word, conformed. I don't like that. I don't like to be conformed into the image, but that's what he says. All things work together for good to those who love God, are called according to his purpose, so he can conform you into the image of his Son. That's why all these things work together for good. It doesn't mean they're pleasant. It doesn't mean they're enjoyable. It means that God's conforming you to his Son. And he's working on the rough edges, and the rough edges are what really hurt. Rough edges of our personality, of our soul, of who we are. God's conforming us through the events of life. And we can choose to ignore that and continue to go through that process over and over again, because God's not moving on until we deal with that. And that's what happened with Abram and Sarah. God was causing these things. Why did she not have children? Because God was building their faith. That's why. He had a better solution to their problem. Why did Abram not step up to the plate at this point? God was conforming him into the image of his Son. One quick last thing, and I want to be careful how I explain it because it can be misunderstood, but we need to be wary of social customs that may lead us away from God's will. What Sarah and Abraham did was perfectly legal and acceptable in the world they lived in. No one would have given it a thought. No one. You know, I can't have a child. Okay, you got a maid. Well, that's the way we do things. But God had spoken to Abram, and Abram should have listened to the voice of God and not to the social custom. That's what he should have done. And for us, the Bible is God's voice. When we come up to different situations, I was having I told a discussion / really in actuality argument with somebody about what we should do, and the person quoted this expert and that expert and that expert, and then another guy joined in. He quoted that expert and that expert and that expert. And at the end of it, because I'm a product of Moody Bible Institute, the only thought in my mind was, and what I blurted out in a very kind, in my own mind way, was, what does the Bible say? I know this guy, that guy, this guy, that guy. What does the Bible say? And that's really the thing here. Yeah, beware. The customs say this and that in our world. You know, our world is so, out of line. Our world is so twisted, you know. And I think it's especially a problem for younger people. You know, they have we didn't grow up like that. We grew up where certain things were certain things. And, you know, the fact that certain things aren't certain things, you know, that's not good. Yes, sometimes it is good. Yeah, sometimes we were stupid. Okay, so we were. And for some of us, we still are. But we need to judge the society we live in by what the Bible says. And many, many younger people and young believers judge by the customs of the world. I mean, the world is a powerful influence. We have to make sure that we do not follow the social customs, but we follow the scriptures. So I think really interesting story, great lessons to learn, that both Abram and Sarah shared plenty of blame in this story. But ultimately, this is the great comfort. I'll leave you with this. God's plan is always accomplished regardless of God's people. And that is such a comforting thought. No matter what happens, God keeps the ship going in the direction that he has. He knows the end from the beginning, and no matter how hard we try to mess it up, it's still going in the same direction.